The next president must be a person who understands, even personalizes, the global quest for dignity and diversity. Personalizes. A person who has shown that even without extensive intelligence briefings, he knew from the very beginning that a solitary war, resented by our friends while mobilizing our enemies, is a fool's enterprise. One political leader did just that, ahead of others. He was not, like many others, a Johnny-come-lately. That leader has had the courage and the resolve to face the painful realities of the war in Iraq and to address them with strategic wisdom. Unlike President Bush, who in dodging his responsibility prolongs the agony while increasing its human costs. That leader has shown also, by his life and by his close communion with mankind's quest for personal dignity, that he can make America again relevant to the cravings of humanity. And so, you good people of Iowa, you have a unique historical opportunity to take the lead in the election of our next president, and thus to change the world. I give you Barack Obama.
Thank you so much. Well, what a wonderful crowd. Thank you so much for the wonderful welcome. I want to begin by, as Dr. Brzezinski did, thanking John Melvin not just for his role in this program, but more importantly for his service to our country. Please give him another round of applause. He tells me he was not nervous being based just outside of Fallujah, but was nervous pronouncing Zbigniew Brzezinski. But he nailed it. He did it flawlessly. And he's a wonderful young man. He's studying at St. Ambrose and studying accounting, and he has a wife and a child. And giving this performance today, we may be running in for something soon, Gene. So if you got the chairwoman of the Democratic Party here in this county, we may have to talk to you about that. Congratulations. Thank you. To Dr. Brzezinski, I can't say enough about his contribution to our country. Here's somebody who helped to shape Camp David and bring about a lasting peace between Israel and some of its neighbors. Somebody who has over decades trained some of the most prominent foreign policy specialists, not just in the Democratic Party, but has trained a number who ended up in the Republican Party as well. He is one of our most outstanding scholars, one of our most outstanding thinkers. He has proven to be an outstanding friend and somebody who I've learned an immense amount from. And for him to support me in this campaign and then be willing to come out here to Iowa is a testimony to his generosity. So if everybody could please give Dr. Brzezinski another round of applause. I want to thank Ashford University and to all the students sincere. I'm so glad that you took the time to come and listen in. And to all the wonderful people of Clinton, I have to say that it was a happy accident, but we do hope that the headline after we leave is Clinton endorses Obama. Clinton gives Obama standing ovation. You know, a few months ago, I met a woman who told me her nephew was leaving for Iraq. And as she started to tell me how much she missed him and how worried she was about him, she began to cry. I can't breathe, she said. I want to know when I'm going to be able to breathe again. Now, I have her on my mind when I think about what we've gone through as a country and where we need to go. Because we've been holding our breath over Iraq for 5 years now. As we go through yet another debate about yet another phase of this misguided war, we've got a familiar feeling. Again, we're told that progress is upon us. Again, we're asked to hold our breath a little longer. Again, we're reminded of what's gone wrong with our policies and with our politics. It was 5 years ago today, on September 12th, 2002, that President Bush made his case for war at the United Nations, standing in front of a world that stood with us after 9/11. He said, and I quote, "In the attacks on America a year ago, we saw the destructive intention of our enemies." Then he talked about Saddam Hussein, a man who had nothing to do with 9/11. But citing the lesson of 9/11, he and others said, we had to act. To suggest otherwise, the president said, is to hope against the evidence. To suggest otherwise, the president said, is to hope against the evidence. George Bush was wrong. The people who attacked us on 9/11 were in Afghanistan, not Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq did not exist before our invasion. The case for war was built on exaggerated fears and empty evidence. So much so that Senator Bob Graham of Florida, who was then the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, decided to vote against the war after he read the National Intelligence Estimate. Unfortunately, conventional thinking in Washington lined up for the war. The pundits judged the political winds to be blowing in the direction of the president. Despite, or perhaps because of how much experience they had in Washington, too many politicians feared looking weak and failed to ask the hard questions. Too many took the president at his word instead of reading the intelligence for themselves. Congress gave the president the authority to go to war, and the only opportunity to stop the war was lost. Now, at that time, I made a different judgment. I thought our priority had to be finishing the fight in Afghanistan. I spoke out against what I call a rash war in Iraq. I worried about an occupation of undetermined length with undetermined costs and undetermined consequences. The full accounting of the costs and consequences will only be known by history. But the picture is beginning to come into focus, and many of you know what those costs are. Nearly 4,000 Americans so far have been killed in Iraq. 5 times that number have suffered horrible wounds, seen and unseen. Loved ones have been lost, dreams have been denied. Children will grow up without fathers and without mothers. Parents have outlived their children. That is the cost of war. When all is said and done, the price tag of this war will run trillion. $1 trillion. That's money not spent on homeland security or counterterrorism, on providing health care to all Americans, and a world-class education to every child, on investment in energy to save ourselves and our planet from an addiction to oil. That too is a cost of this war. The excellence of our military is unmatched. But as a result of this war, our forces are under pressure as never before. Our National Guard and Reserves have half of the equipment they need to respond to emergencies at home and abroad. Retention among West Point graduates is down. Our powers of deterrence and influence around the world are down. That is a cost of this war. America's standing has suffered. Our diplomacy has been compromised by a refusal to talk to people who we don't like. Our alliances have been compromised by bluster. Our credibility has been compromised by a faulty case for war. Our moral leadership has been compromised by Abu Ghraib. That is the cost of this war. Perhaps the saddest irony of the administration's cynical use of 9/11 is that the Iraq War has left us less safe than we were before 9/11. Osama bin Laden and his top lieutenants have rebuilt a new base in Pakistan where they are training recruits, plotting new attacks, and disseminating propaganda. The Taliban is resurgent in Afghanistan. Iran has emerged as the greatest strategic threat to America in the Middle East in a generation. Violent extremism has increased. Terrorism has increased. All of that is a cost of this war. After 9/11, instead of the politics of unity, we got a politics that involved division, a political strategy of division with the war in Iraq as its centerpiece. The only thing we were asked to do for our country was support a misguided war and to go shopping. We lost that sense of common purpose as Americans. And we're not going to be truly united and resolute as Americans until we can stop holding our breath, until we can come together and reclaim our foreign policy and our politics and end this war that has cost us too much. So there's something unreal about the debate that's been taking place in Washington. I flew in from Washington this morning. With all that our troops and our families have sacrificed, with all that this war has cost us, and with no discernible end in sight, the same people who told us we would be greeted as liberators, about democracy spreading across the Middle East, about striking a decisive blow against terrorism, about an insurgency in its last throes, those same people are now trumpeting the uneven and precarious containment of brutal sectarian violence as if it validates all of their failed decisions. The bar for success is so low that it's almost buried in the sand. The American people have had enough of shifting spin. We've had enough of extended deadlines for benchmarks that go unmet. We've had enough of mounting costs in Iraq and missed opportunities around the world. We've had enough of a war that should have never been authorized and should have never been waged. I opposed this war from the beginning. I opposed the war in 2002, I opposed the war in 2003, I opposed it in 2004 and 2005 and 2006. I introduced a plan in January to remove all of our combat brigades out of Iraq by next March. And I'm here to say that we have to begin to end this war now. Not tomorrow. My plan for ending the war would turn the page in Iraq by removing our combat troops from Iraq's civil war, by taking a new approach to press for a new accord on reconciliation within Iraq, by talking to all of Iraq's neighbors to press for a compact in the region, and by confronting the human costs of this war. To begin with, we need to immediately begin the responsible removal of our troops from Iraq's civil war. Our troops like John Melvin have performed brilliantly. They brought Saddam Hussein to justice. They have fought for over 4 years now to give Iraqis a chance for a better future. But they cannot and should not bear the responsibility for resolving the grievances at the heart of Iraq's civil war. Recent news only confirms this. The administration points to selective statistics to make the case for staying the course. Killings and mortar attacks and car bombs in certain districts are down from the highest levels that we've seen. But they're still at the same horrible levels that they were at 18 months ago or 2 years ago. Let me repeat that. Yesterday, General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, pointing to this reduction in violence. We are at the same levels of violence now that we were back in June of 2006. That is the improvement that's been made after an additional 30,000 troops and $1 billion have been spent in Iraq. Experts will tell you that the killings are down in some places because the ethnic cleansing has already taken place. Shias have already driven Sunnis from certain neighborhoods. And as a consequence, there may not be immediate, constant warfare on the streets of Baghdad, but nobody believes that the dynamics of sectarianism have changed there. That is hardly a cause for triumphalism. The stated purpose of the surge was to enable Iraq's leaders to reconcile. But as the recent reports from the Government Accountability Office confirms, the Iraqis are not reconciling. Our troops fight and die in 20-degree heat to give Iraq's leaders the space to agree, but they aren't filling that space. They're not moving beyond their centuries-old sectarian conflicts. They're falling back further into them. We hear a lot about how violence is down in parts of Anbar province, but this has little to do with the surge. It's because Sunni tribal leaders made a political decision to turn against al-Qaeda in Iraq. This only underscores the point. The solution in Iraq is political. It is not military. Violence is contained in some parts of Baghdad. That's no surprise. Our troops have cleared these neighborhoods at enormous costs. But our troops cannot patrol Baghdad indefinitely. Only Iraqis can. Rather than use our presence to make progress, the Iraqi government has put off taking responsibility. That's the finding of a commission headed by General Jim Jones. And our troop presence cannot be sustained without crippling our military's ability to respond to other contingencies. So let me be clear. There is no military solution in Iraq. There never was. The best way to protect our security and to pressure Iraq's leaders to resolve their civil war is to immediately begin to remove our combat troops. Not in 6 months or 1 year, but now. To execute this, we should enter into talks with the Iraqi government to discuss the process of our drawdown. We must get out strategically and carefully, removing troops from secure areas first, and keeping troops in more volatile areas until later. But our drawdown should proceed at a steady pace of 1 or 2 brigades each month. If we start now, all our combat brigades should be out of Iraq by the end of next year. We will need to retain some forces in Iraq and in the region. We'll continue to strike at al-Qaeda in Iraq. We'll protect our forces as they leave, and we'll continue to protect U.S. diplomats and facilities. If, but only if, progress and their security forces are determined not to be sectarian, we should continue to train and equip those forces. But we will set our own direction and our own pace, and that direction must be out of Iraq. The future of our military, our foreign policy, and our national purpose cannot be hostage to the inaction of the Iraqi government. Removing our troops is part of applying real pressure on Iraqis' leaders to end their civil war. Some argue that we should just replace Prime Minister Maliki, but that wouldn't solve the problem. We shouldn't be in the business, first of all, of supporting coups. And remember, before Maliki, we said that we just needed to replace the last Prime Minister to make everything all right. It didn't work. The problems in Iraq are bigger than just one man. Iraq needs a new constitutional convention that would include representatives from all levels of Iraqi society, in and out of government. The United Nations should play a crucial central role in convening and participating in this convention, which should not adjourn until a new accord on national reconciliation is reached. To reconcile, the Iraqis must also meet key political benchmarks outside of the constitutional process, including new local elections and revising de-Baathification. Now, the Iraqis may come out of this process choosing some sort of soft partition into 3 regions. One Sunni, one Shia, one Kurd. This has been proposed by some commentators and some candidates. But it must be their choice. America should not impose the division of Iraq. While we change the dynamic within Iraq, we also have to surge our diplomatic efforts in the region. At every stage of this war, we have suffered because of disdain for diplomacy. We have not brought our allies to the table. We have refused to talk to people we don't like, and we failed to build a consensus in the region. As a result, Iraq is more violent, the region is less stable, and America is less secure. We need to launch the most aggressive diplomatic effort in recent history to reach a new compact in the region. This effort should include all of Iraq's neighbors, and we should also bring in the United Nations Security Council. All of us have a stake in Iraq's stability. It's time to make this less about what America is trying to do for Iraq and more about what the world can do with Iraq. This compact must secure borders, keep neighbors from meddling, isolate al-Qaeda in Iraq, and support Iraq's unity. That means helping our Turkish and Kurdish friends reach an understanding. That means pressing Sunni states like Saudi Arabia to stop the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq, increase their financial support of reconstruction efforts, and encourage Iraqi Sunnis to reconcile with their fellow Iraqis. And that means turning the page on the Bush-Cheney policy of not talking to Syria and Iran. Conventional thinking in Washington says that presidents cannot lead this diplomacy. But I think the American people know better. Not talking doesn't make us look tough. It makes us look arrogant. And it doesn't get results. Strong presidents tell their adversaries where they stand, and that's what I will do. That's how tough, principled diplomacy works. And that's what we need to press Syria and Iran to stop being part of the problem in Iraq. Iran in particular poses a grave challenge. It builds a nuclear program, supports terrorism, and threatens Israel with destruction. But we hear eerie echoes in the run-up to the war in Iraq in the way the President and the Vice President talk about Iran. They conflate Iran and al-Qaeda, ignoring the violent schism that exists between Shia and Sunni militants. They issue veiled threats. They suggest that the time for diplomacy and pressure is running out when we haven't even tried direct diplomacy. Well, George Bush and Dick Cheney must hear, loud and clear, from the American people and the Congress. You do not have our support and you do not have our authorization to launch another war. George Bush suggests that there are two choices with regard to Iran. Stay the course in Iraq or cede the region to Iran. I reject this choice. Keeping our troops tied down in Iraq is not the way to weaken Iran, it's precisely what has strengthened it. President Ahmadinejad may talk about filling a vacuum in the region after an American drawdown, but he's badly mistaken. It's time for a new and robust American leadership, and that should begin with a new cooperative security framework with all of our friends and allies in the Persian Gulf. Now is the time for tough and sustained diplomacy backed by real pressure. It's time to rally the region and the world to our side. It's time to deliver a direct message to Tehran that America is part of a community of nations. America wants peace in the region. We can say to Iran, you can give up your nuclear ambitions and support for terror and rejoin this community of nations, or you will face further isolation, including much tighter sanctions. As we deliver this message, we will be stronger, not weaker, if we are disengaging from Iraq's civil war. The final part of my plan is a major international initiative to address Iraq's humanitarian crisis. President Bush likes to warn of the dire consequences of ending American troop presences in Iraq. He warns of rising Iranian influence, but that has already taken place. He warns of growing terrorism, but that has already taken place. And he warns of huge movements of refugees and mass sectarian killing, but that has already taken place. These are not the consequences of a future withdrawal. They are the reality of Iraq's present. They are a direct consequence of waging this war. 2 million Iraqis are displaced within their own country. Another 2 million Iraqis have fled as refugees to neighboring countries. That's 4 million people out of their homes. This mass movement of people is a threat to the security of the Middle East and to our common humanity. We have a strategic interest, but also a moral obligation to act. The President would have us believe, once again, that there are two choices. Keep all of our troops in Iraq or abandon these Iraqis. Again, I reject that choice. We cannot continue to put this burden on our troops alone. I'm tired of this notion that we either fight foolish wars or retreat from the world. We are better than that as a nation. There is no military solution that can reunite a family or resettle an orphan child. It's time to form an international working group with the countries in the region, our European and Asian friends, and the United Nations. The State Department says it has invested $183 million on displaced Iraqis this year, but that is not nearly enough for the 4 million that have been displaced. We can and must do more. We should up our share to at least $2 billion to support this effort, to expand access to social services for refugees in neighboring countries, and to ensure that Iraqis displaced inside their own country can find safe haven. We're not talking about global aids today. We're talking about Iraq. Iraqis must know that those who engage in mass violence will be brought to justice. We should lead in forming a commission of the United Nations to monitor and hold accountable perpetrators of war crimes inside Iraq. We must also put strict conditions on U.S. assistance to direct our support to those who want to hold Iraq together, not those who are tearing it apart. The risk of greater atrocities in the short term cannot deter us from doing what we must to minimize violence in the long term. Yet as we draw down, we must declare our readiness to intervene with allies to stop genocidal violence. We also have to keep faith with Iraqis who kept faith with us. You know, one of the tragic outcomes of this war is that the Iraqis who stood with America, the interpreters, embassy workers, and subcontractors, are being targeted for assassination. An Iraqi named Layth, who was was working for an American agency, told the journalist, "Sometimes I feel like we're standing in line for a ticket waiting to die. And yet our doors are shut." In April, we admitted exactly one Iraqi refugee. Just one. That's not how we treat our friends. That's not how we take responsibility for our own actions. It's not who we are as Americans. It's time to at least fill the 7,000 slots that we pledged to Iraqi refugees and to be open to accepting even more Iraqis who are truly at risk. It's also time to go to our friends and allies and all the members of our original coalition in Iraq to find homes for many Iraqis who are in desperate need of asylum. Keeping this moral obligation is a key part of how we turn the page in Iraq. Because what's at stake is bigger than this war. It's our global leadership. Now's the time to be bold. We must not stay the course or take the conventional path because the other course is unknown. To quote Dr. Brzezinski, we must not allow ourselves to become prisoners of uncertainty. George Bush is afraid of the future. That's why all he can do is drag up the past. After all the flawed justifications for his failed policy, recently he invoked Vietnam as a reason to stay in Iraq. Now let's put aside the strange reasoning that all would have been well if we had just stayed the course in Vietnam. Let's put it aside and leave it where it belongs, in the past. Now's not the time to re-argue the Vietnam War. We did that in the 2004 election, and it wasn't very pretty. I come from a new generation of Americans. I don't want to fight the battles of the 1960s. I want to reclaim the future for America, because we have too many threats to face and too many opportunities to seize. Just think about what we can accomplish together when we end this war. When we end this war in Iraq, we can finally finish the fight in Afghanistan. That's why I propose stepping up our commitment there with at least 2 additional combat brigades and a comprehensive aid program and support program to help Afghans help themselves. When we end this war in Iraq, we can more effectively tackle the twin demons of extremism and hopelessness that threaten the peace of the world and the security of America. That's why I proposed a program to spread hope, not hate, in the Islamic world. To build schools that teach young people to build and not destroy, to support the rule of law and economic development, and to launch a program of outreach to the Islamic world that I will lead as president. When we end this war, we can once again lead the world against the common challenges of the 21st century, against the spread of nuclear weapons and climate change, against genocide in Darfur, against ignorance and intolerance, corruption and greed, poverty and despair, and global AIDS. When we end this war, we can reclaim the cause of freedom and democracy. We can be that beacon of hope, that light to all the world. When we end this war, we can recapture our unity of effort as Americans. The American people had the right instincts on Iraq. It's time to heed their judgment. It's time to move beyond Iraq so we can move forward together. I will be a president who listens to the American people, not a president who ignores the American people. And when we end this war in Iraq, we can finally come together to give our full attention to advancing the cause of health care for every American, an energy policy that does not bankroll hostile nations, but enough to fill lifestyle, and a world-class education for all of our children. Above all, we can turn the page on a new kind of politics. We can create a politics of unity, not division. Politics of hope, not fear. And I welcome all the folks who have changed their position on the war over these last months and years. And we need more of those votes to change if we're going to change the direction of this war. That's why I'll keep speaking directly to my colleagues in the Congress, both Republican and Democratic. Historically, we've come together in a bipartisan way to deal with our most monumental challenges. We should do so again. We have the power to do this, not as Republicans and Democrats, but as Americans. We don't have to wait until George Bush is gone from office. We can begin to end this war today, right now. But if we have learned anything from Iraq, it is that the judgment that matters most is the judgment that is made first. Martin Luther King once stood up at Riverside Church in New York City and said, and I quote, "In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. We are too late to stop a war that should have never been fought. Too late to undo the pain of battle, the anguish of so many families, or the price of the fight. Too late to redo the years of division and distraction at home and abroad. But I am here today because it's not too late to come together as Americans. Because we're not going to be able to deal with the challenges that confront us until we end this war. We can do all that we can and say that we are not going to be prisoners of uncertainty, that we reject the conventional thinking that led us into Iraq and that didn't ask hard questions until it was too late. We can learn from our past mistakes. What we can say is that we are ready for something new and something bold and something principled. In other words, it's time for us to breathe again. That begins with ending this war, but it does not end there. It's time to reclaim our foreign policy as well. It's time to reclaim our politics. Most of all, it's time to lead this country and this world again to a new dawn of peace and unity. Thank you very much.